The cabin lights dimmed at 37,000 feet, and most of first class had already surrendered to sleep. Row 9 was quiet except for the hum of pressurized air and the occasional clink of ice in abandoned cocktail glasses. In seat 9C, wrapped in a cashmere blanket with noise-canceling headphones resting against her collarbone, Mackenzie, Revenant, Graves slept the dreamless sleep of someone who'd learned to shut down completely when rest was available. Her face was turned toward the window, dark hair spilling across the headrest, one hand tucked beneath her cheek like a child's. The business magazines in the seat pocket beside her showed her face on 3 different covers. Forbes called her the logistics queen who'd revolutionized military supply chain software. Fortune dubbed her the veteran who'd turned trauma into a 9-figure empire. None of them mentioned what she really was, what she'd been before the boardrooms and the venture capital and the keynote speeches. They didn't know about the 73 combat missions or the call sign that still made Air Force colonels straighten their posture when they heard it. They certainly didn't know she maintained her flight certifications, logging hours in everything from Cessnas to reconditioned fighters at private airstrips where questions weren't asked. She looked like money now, tailored and polished, but her hands still bore the faint scars from ejection burns, and her eyes still tracked exits in every room she entered. 4 rows back, the man in 13D wasn't sleeping. He'd been watching her since boarding in Dubai, his eyes returning to her seat with the methodical patience of someone conducting surveillance. His passport said he was James Chen, an oil executive heading home to Los Angeles, but the tactical watch hidden beneath his sleeve cuff told a different story. So did the encrypted phone he checked every 11 minutes, its screen flashing brief messages in abbreviated military syntax that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't operated in the darkness between official wars. He'd been activated 6 hours ago, pulled from a beach in Bali where he'd been spending his mandatory decompression leave. The mission parameters were thin, almost insulting in their vagueness. Package retrieval, high-value target, non-permissive environment, time critical. And one other detail that had made him question whether command had finally lost its mind. Civilian specialist required, must have multi-engine combat flight experience, immediate availability. The dossier they'd sent him had 3 names. 2 were overseas, unreachable within the operational window. The third was sleeping in seat 9C, unaware that her quiet overnight flight was about to become something else entirely. The Boeing 777 carved through the night sky over the Pacific, following invisible corridors mapped by GPS and international aviation treaties. In the cockpit, Captain Miller stretched his shoulders and accepted a fresh cup of coffee from his co-pilot. The flight was running perfectly, passengers calm, systems nominal, weather clear all the way to lax. He had 14,000 flight hours, 3 grown children, and a retirement date circled on his kitchen calendar. This was exactly the kind of boring, professional, utterly routine flight that made his career feel like a quiet success. He had no idea that in approximately 40 minutes, his aircraft would receive a priority military transmission on a frequency that wasn't supposed to exist in civilian aviation. He didn't know that sleeping in his first-class cabin was someone with more combat flight hours than his entire flight crew combined, or that the man in 13D was carrying authorization codes that could commandeer his aircraft under statutes most pilots never even heard about in training. The night was calm, and the stars were sharp and clear through the cockpit windows, and everything was about to change. In the main cabin, a flight attendant named Rebecca moved quietly through the aisles, collecting empty cups and straightening blankets. She'd been flying international routes for 6 years, long enough to recognize the different types of passengers by how they slept. The exhausted businessmen who fought consciousness until the last second. The families sprawled awkwardly across multiple seats. The nervous flyers who never quite relaxed. The woman in 9C slept differently, Rebecca noticed. There was a stillness to her that seemed almost tactical, a complete shutdown that suggested this wasn't someone who struggled with rest when it was available. Rebecca had a brother in the army, and she recognized something in that quality of sleep, the way soldiers learned to grab rest whenever the opportunity presented itself. She moved past without disturbing her, unaware that in less than an hour this sleeping passenger would be the most important person on the aircraft. The message came through at 2:47 hours Zulu time, encrypted on a military frequency that civilian aircraft weren't supposed to monitor. Captain Miller almost ignored it, his hand hovering over the communication panel before training made him answer. The voice on the other end was crisp, female, and carried the particular tone of someone who expected immediate compliance. November 773, this is Reach Control on Secure Channel. Authenticate Bravo Mike Foxtrot 7. Miller's co-pilot, younger and less experienced, looked at him with confusion spreading across his face. Miller felt his stomach drop. He'd heard stories about this kind of contact, usually third-hand in pilot lounges, the kind of tailies that sounded like aviation mythology. Aircraft diverted for national security purposes. Passengers who turned out to be more than they seemed. He authenticated the code, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to work through his system. The response was immediate and non-negotiable. November 773, you are directed to establish contact with passenger in seat 9 Charlie. Do not use public address system. Send senior cabin crew only. Passenger will authenticate with the phrase Ghost Walker Actual. You are to provide all assistance requested. This directive comes with National Security Authority. Acknowledge. Mackenzie was dreaming, which was rare for her. In the dream, she was flying low over sand, the kind of endless rolling desert that characterized the operations she didn't talk about at board meetings. Her hands were on the stick of an A-10 Warthog, that ugly, beautiful titanium bathtub that had kept her alive through situations that still woke her up sometimes, even years later. The aircraft felt real in the dream, the vibration of the engines, the weight of the cannon beneath her, the way the desert air created thermals that required constant tiny corrections. She was looking for something, tracking coordinates that kept shifting, and there was a voice on the radio trying to reach her, growing more insistent. The voice was wrong somehow, civilian, female, apologetic. In the dream it didn't make sense, and the wrongness of it began to pull her toward consciousness. She felt the transition, that moment when the mind realizes it's dreaming and begins the ascent toward waking. Her eyes opened in the dim cabin, and Rebecca was there, leaning close with an expression that was professional but strained. "Ma'am, I'm very sorry to wake you, but there's a situation that requires your immediate attention. The captain needs to speak with you privately." Mackenzie's transition to full alertness was instantaneous, the legacy of too many nights where sleep ended with klaxons and scrambles. She assessed Rebecca's face, the tension around her eyes, the way her hand gripped the seat back just slightly too tight. Not a medical emergency, not turbulence, something else. What situation? She asked quietly, her voice calm but her mind already running threat scenarios. Rebecca leaned closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "The captain has received instructions from a military authority. I'm supposed to tell you. Ghost Walker Actual." The cabin seemed to contract around those words. Mackenzie felt ice slide down her spine, a mixture of adrenaline and something darker, older. That phrase belonged to a different life, to missions that officially never happened, to an organization within an organization that she'd thought she'd left behind when she hung up her flight suit. She'd been out for 4 years, fully civilian. Her security clearances transitioned to inactive status. Ghost Walker Actual was a protocol designation she'd hoped never to hear again. She unclipped her seatbelt with practiced efficiency, her movements smooth despite her heart rate climbing. "Where?" Rebecca gestured toward the forward galley, where the cabin crew usually prepared service. Mackenzie followed, her mind racing through possibilities. The man from 13D was suddenly standing as well, moving into the aisle with the kind of casual confidence that immediately marked him as military to anyone who knew what to look for. His eyes met hers and he gave the smallest nod, a gesture of recognition between operators. She didn't know him, but she knew what he was. Special operations, probably Tier 1 by the way he carried himself, by the controlled economy of his movements. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a recall, and if they were pulling her off a commercial flight at altitude, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The forward galley was small, designed for efficiency rather than space. Captain Miller stood there looking like a man who just discovered his routine flight had been hijacked by circumstances beyond his training. The man from 13D followed her in, pulling the curtain closed behind them. "Mackenzie Graves?" the man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. She nodded once, her eyes moving between him and the captain, analyzing, assessing. "I'm going to need to see some identification beyond your boarding pass," she said quietly. He reached into his jacket with slow, deliberate movements, producing a credential case that he flipped open. The ID was unmarked except for a number and a seal she recognized. Joint Special Operations Command, Tier 1. Her assessment had been correct. "Lieutenant Commander Adrian Cross, DEVGRU," he said, his voice low and professional. "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, but we have a situation that requires your immediate assistance." She glanced at Captain Miller, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Captain, could you give us a moment?" Miller hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being dismissed from a conversation about his own aircraft, but the look Cross gave him suggested this wasn't a request. He nodded stiffly and retreated to the cockpit, leaving them alone in the galley. Mackenzie crossed her arms, her posture shifting subtly into something harder, more guarded. "I've been out for 4 years. My clearances are inactive. Whatever you think you need, there are active pilots who—" Cross cut her off with a shake of his head. "This isn't about clearances, and we don't have time for the full briefing. 37 minutes ago, a CIA extraction team was compromised in Somalia. They're pinned down with a high-value asset taking fire, and their exfil bird took an RPG. They have one functioning aircraft left, a confiscated Russian transport, barely airworthy. The pilot was killed in the initial ambush. They need someone who can fly an Antonov An-26 in combat conditions, at night, through hostile territory, and land it on a beach with no runway lights. The operational window closes in 4 hours. We have 3 qualified pilots, and the entire DoD. One is in a hospital in Landstuhl. One is wheels up over the Atlantic with mechanical problems. You're the third, and you're the only one we can get there in time." Mackenzie felt the words land like physical blows, each detail adding weight to a picture she didn't want to see. Somalia, compromised extraction, dying asset. It had all the hallmarks of the operations she'd sworn she was done with. She looked at Cross, really looked at him, and saw the strain around his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. He wasn't selling this. He was desperate. "What's the asset?" she asked, her voice flat. Cross hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and in that hesitation she knew this was the part he didn't want to tell her. "Sarah Chen, CIA operations officer. She's been deep cover for 3 years, just broke a major human trafficking network. She has intelligence on 12 different organizations, names, routes, everything. If she's captured, hundreds of assets die. If she's killed, years of work dies with her. She's also," he paused, something flickering across his face that might have been genuine emotion. "She's also my sister-in-law. My wife's little sister. She's 29 years old, and she's been sending messages for the past hour saying goodbye to her family because she thinks she's going to die in that compound before dawn." The galley seemed smaller suddenly, the hum of the aircraft engines louder. Mackenzie felt the familiar weight settling onto her shoulders, the burden she'd carried through 73 combat missions, the responsibility that never quite left even after she'd resigned her commission. "You're asking me to divert this commercial aircraft, fly into a combat zone in a country where we have no official presence, steal a Russian transport plane I've never seen before, and somehow extract a pinned-down CIA team through hostile fire, all before sunrise. Do you understand how insane that sounds?" Cross nodded slowly. "I do. I also understand that you're the only person in range who has the skills to make it work. Your service record shows 42 combat missions in the A-10, 18 in Special Operations Insertion with modified C-130s, and training on 17 different aircraft types including Soviet-era transports. You were the go-to pilot for the operations nobody else would touch. They called you Revenant because you kept coming back from missions that should have killed you. She hated hearing her call sign out loud, hated the memories it dragged up. That was a different life, she said, but her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. Cross pressed forward, sensing her resistance weakening. The team on the ground has 4 hours of ammunition left, maybe less. There's a militia group closing in, 200 strong, and they know what they have. This isn't a random firefight. This is an execution countdown. Mackenzie closed her eyes briefly, and in that darkness she saw the faces of the pilots she'd known who hadn't come back, the ones who'd believed the mission was always worth it, who'd paid the price for that belief. She saw Sarah Chen too, a woman she'd never met, 29 years old, probably terrified, definitely brave enough to have spent 3 years in deep cover. She opened her eyes and found Cross watching her with the intensity of someone who just played his last card. If I do this, if I agree to this absolute insanity, I need full operational authority. No second guessing, no remote command interference. I fly how I need to fly, I make the calls I need to make. And I need your word that if this goes sideways, if I don't make it back, my company and my people are taken care of. No legal complications, no congressional inquiries that destroy what I've built. Cross extended his hand without hesitation. You have my word, and more importantly, you have the word of the Joint Special Operations Command. This mission has presidential authorization. Everything will be handled. She took his hand, feeling the calluses that marked him as someone who still trained hard, who still kept himself ready. Then I guess I'm going back to work, she said quietly. But I'm going to need a few things, starting with a full tactical briefing, current satellite imagery, and a completely illegal amount of coffee. For the first time since entering the galley, Cross allowed himself a tight smile. All of that is waiting. We have a military transport standing by at a remote airfield in Oman. We'll divert there, transfer you to the C-17, and have you wheels down in Somalia in under 3 hours. The team on the ground is sending regular updates. The situation is stable for now, but deteriorating. Mackenzie nodded, her mind already shifting into operational mode, running calculations of distance, fuel loads, approach angles. It was like putting on an old coat, familiar despite the years since she'd worn it. I need to grab my bag, and someone needs to tell the passengers something that sounds reasonable because this is going to cause questions. Cross pulled back the curtain slightly, gesturing for her to lead. Captain Miller is prepared to announce a medical emergency requiring an immediate diversion. Happens more often than people think. Most passengers will be annoyed, not suspicious. They moved back through the cabin, Mackenzie acutely aware of the sleeping passengers around her, the normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that their flight had just been commandeered for a special operations mission. She pulled her carry-on from the overhead bin with quick efficiency, slinging it over her shoulder. The bag contained her laptop, some files, a change of clothes, and buried at the bottom beneath a false panel that TSA had never found, her old dog tags and the small Glock 43 she'd carried on every flight for the past 4 years. Old habits died hard, and some habits were worth keeping. Cross led her forward toward the cockpit, moving with purpose. As they passed through business class, a few passengers stirred, sensing the subtle shift in energy, the change in the aircraft's routine. Mackenzie kept her face neutral, professional, just another passenger being attended to by the crew. They reached the cockpit door, and Cross knocked twice in a specific pattern. The door opened immediately, Captain Miller's face appearing in the gap. His eyes found Mackenzie, and she saw him reassessing her, trying to reconcile the sleeping billionaire with whatever he'd been told in the last 10 minutes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the particular respect pilots reserved for other pilots, "we're beginning our diversion to Muscat International. We'll be on the ground in approximately 90 minutes. I've been instructed to provide you with access to our secure communication system and to assist in any way possible." Mackenzie stepped into the cockpit, the familiar layout of instruments and displays triggering muscle memory she'd thought had faded. She'd flown 777s before in her private training, keeping current on civilian aircraft as well as military ones. The co-pilot was young, probably early 30s, and he watched her with unconcealed curiosity. Cross remained in the doorway, his presence filling the small space. "Captain, I need you to establish communication with Reach Control again. Use the authentication code they provided earlier. Tell them Revenant is active and moving to operational staging." Miller nodded, his hands moving over the communication panel with practiced ease. The radio crackled to life, and a different voice answered this time, male, older, carrying the weight of command authority. "Revenant, this is Ghost Walker Control. Authenticate Sierra November 7-4. Mackenzie felt the old protocols flooding back, the call-and-response patterns that had been drilled into her during special operations training. "Ghost Walker Control, authenticate Tango Romeo 38. Revenant is active, moving to staging. Request current situation report and tactical package." There was a brief pause, and she could imagine the operations center on the other end, probably buried somewhere in a classified facility, multiple screens showing satellite feeds and real-time intelligence. "Revenant, situation is critical. Team is holding at coordinates 3602 north, 0047 west. Enemy forces estimated at 200 plus, armored technicals, RPGs confirmed. Friendly ammunition status is amber. Casualties are 2 wounded, both mobile. Asset is secure but location is compromised. Exfil Bird is a confiscated in 26 Soviet manufacture, minimal maintenance records. It's fueled but unverified for flight worthiness. Your mission is to reach the aircraft, conduct pre-flight under combat conditions, extract the team, and fly them to friendly territory. We'll have F-18s providing air cover once you're airborne, but you're on your own for the landing and extraction." The clinical briefing couldn't hide the reality of what they were asking. She'd be landing at a hostile location, in the dark, in an aircraft she'd never flown before, under fire, and then taking off again with a plane full of people depending on her to thread the needle between enemy fire and mechanical failure. It was exactly the kind of mission that had earned her the call sign Revenant, because she'd done impossible extractions before and somehow always come back. But that was years ago, when she was younger, when the edge was sharper, when she hadn't built a life she actually wanted to keep. Cross was watching her face, reading the calculation happening behind her eyes. "The team on the ground is good," he said quietly. "Former Delta, 2 SEALs, 1 Marine Raider. They know how to hold a perimeter. And Sarah knows how to stay alive. She's made it 3 years in places that eat operators for breakfast. She's not going to fold now, not when extraction is coming." Mackenzie appreciated that he wasn't trying to minimize the danger, wasn't selling her false hope. "Tell me about the N-26, she said, her voice shifting into the professional tone she used when evaluating tactical problems. "I've flown Soviet aircraft before, but each one has quirks." The voice from Ghost Walker Control responded immediately, suggesting they'd anticipated the question. "The N-26 is a twin-turboprop transport, NATO designation curl. It's robust, designed for rough field operations, which works in your favor. The controls are conventional but heavy, no hydraulic boost. You'll be fighting the aircraft physically, especially on takeoff. The gauges are in Cyrillic, but we're sending you a translated cockpit layout to your datapad. The main risks are the engines. Both are old and maintenance is questionable, and the landing gear, which has been known to fail under stress. You'll need to do a visual inspection before you trust it, but you won't have much time. The beach where you're landing is hard-packed sand, approximately 800 meters of usable surface at low tide, which is in your favor. Current tide tables show you'll have optimal conditions in your operational window. 800 meters on sand in the dark. She'd done worse, but not by much. What about defensive systems? Flares, chaff? Another brief pause, and she knew the answer before they spoke. Negative, the aircraft was used for smuggling operations. It's stripped down. You'll be relying on nap-of-the-earth flight and darkness for protection. Once you're airborne, the F-18s can provide cover, but you need to get off that beach first. Cross spoke up from behind her. The team has portable surface-to-air deterrents. They'll keep any pursuing aircraft off your back during takeoff. Your job is just to get the bird in the air and keep it there long enough to reach friendly airspace. Just get the bird in the air. As if that were simple. As if she hadn't seen a dozen aircraft go down from mechanical failure, enemy fire, pilot error, bad luck. But complaining wouldn't change the mission parameters, and these people wouldn't be asking if they had any other options. She thought about Sarah Chen again, 29 years old, saying goodbye to her family, believing she was going to die in some compound in Somalia because her ride home had been shot down. "All right," Mackenzie said, her voice carrying the decision. "Let's do this. Get me to Oman, get me in that C-17, and get me current intelligence on enemy positions around the landing zone. I'll need maps, satellite photos, everything you have. And I want direct communication with the team on the ground. I need to coordinate with whoever's running their tactical side." Cross nodded sharply, relief evident in the easing of tension across his shoulders. "All of that is ready. The C-17 is configured for rapid tactical briefing. You'll have everything you need before we hit Somalia, and the team leader on the ground is call sign Hammer. Former Delta, 20 years of experience, smart and steady. You'll be in good hands." Captain Miller had been listening to all of this with increasing concern, his responsibility for his passengers warring with the orders he'd been given. "Ma'am, how long will we be delayed in Muscat? My passengers will need to be informed, and the airline will need to make arrangements." Mackenzie turned to him, seeing the decent man caught in an impossible situation, trying to do right by everyone. "Captain, I appreciate your professionalism. The delay will be minimal for your passengers. As soon as I'm off your aircraft, you'll be cleared to continue to Los Angeles. The cover story about a medical emergency is close enough to the truth. Tell them a passenger needed immediate evacuation for a cardiac issue, and that you'll be continuing as soon as you've refueled. Most of them won't even remember this as more than an inconvenience." He nodded, accepting her answer, though his eyes lingered on her with questions he was professional enough not to ask. She could see him wondering who she really was, what kind of person got pulled off a civilian flight for a military operation. Cross was already moving back toward the main cabin, pulling out his encrypted phone to make arrangements. Mackenzie stayed in the cockpit for a moment longer, looking out through the windscreen at the night sky stretching endlessly ahead. The stars were brilliant up here, away from ground light pollution, sharp points of light that had guided navigators for thousands of years before GPS and satellite positioning. She'd learned to fly by those stars in her earliest training, back when she'd been young and eager, and convinced she was invincible. She pulled out her own phone, not the encrypted military-grade device she'd just been handed by Cross, but her regular civilian phone with all the trappings of her normal life. 3 unread emails from her executive team, a text from her assistant about tomorrow's board meeting, a notification from her fitness app congratulating her on maintaining her streak. The mundane details of a life she'd built carefully, deliberately, away from the chaos and violence she'd left behind. She typed a quick message to her chief operating officer, keeping it vague but clear enough that he'd understand something was wrong. "Family emergency. Will be out of contact for 24-48 hours. You have authority to handle everything. Trust your judgment." She hit send before she could second-guess it. The board meeting would have to wait. The investors would have to wait. Everything would have to wait, because 4,000 miles away, a woman she'd never met was counting down the hours until she either lived or died, and apparently Mackenzie was the only person who could tip those scales. She made her way back through the aircraft toward her seat, needing to gather her thoughts before they landed. The man who'd been sitting in 13D was gone now, his seat empty, probably forward with cross-coordinating details. She settled back into 9C, but sleep was impossible now, adrenaline singing through her system like an electrical current. She pulled out the tablet Cross had given her, its screen showing a classified briefing document that began with the words Operation Crimson Retrieval. The name was typical military designation, designed to be meaningless to anyone who didn't have the full context. She scrolled through pages of intelligence reports, satellite photos, tactical assessments. The compound where the team was pinned showed up in infrared imagery, heat signatures clustered in defensive positions, while multiple groups of hostiles maintained a perimeter at cautious distance. They weren't rushing in, which meant they either didn't know exactly what they had or they were waiting for dawn when they could assault with better visibility. Either way, the clock was ticking. The profile on Sarah Chen was sparse, mostly redacted, but what remained painted a picture of someone exceptional, fluent in 4 languages, multiple deep-cover operations across East Africa. Psychological profile marked her as resilient, adaptable with unusually high stress tolerance. There was a photo, probably taken before she went under, showing a young woman with serious eyes and a slight smile that didn't quite reach those eyes. She looked like someone who'd already seen things that aged her beyond her years, and that was before she'd spent 3 years pretending to be someone else in places where discovery meant death. Mackenzie studied the photo, committing the face to memory. This was who she was flying into a combat zone to save. This was the person whose life depended on her ability to remember skills she hadn't used operationally in 4 years, to fly an aircraft she'd never touched, to navigate through hostile territory in the dark. The weight of that responsibility settled onto her shoulders like a familiar burden, uncomfortable but not unwelcome. She'd missed this, she realized with some surprise. Not the danger, not the violence, but the clarity of it. The absolute focus required when lives hung in the balance. In her corporate life, the stakes were financial, reputational, important but abstract. Here, the stakes were immediate and real. Either she succeeded or people died. There was a brutal honesty to that equation. The Boeing 777 began its descent toward Muscat, and Captain Miller's voice came over the intercom with a calm, professional announcement about the medical emergency diversion. Mackenzie listened to the stirring in the cabin, the confused murmurs of passengers waking to unexpected news, the irritation and concern mixing in their voices. She felt oddly separate from them, already transitioning mentally to the mission ahead, to the cockpit of an aircraft she'd never seen, to a beach in Somalia where the difference between success and catastrophe would be measured in seconds and decisions. The landing was smooth, Miller bringing them in with the practiced ease of thousands of hours. They taxied to a remote section of the airport, away from the commercial terminals, where Mackenzie could see the angular shape of a C-17 Globemaster waiting with its engines already running. Cross appeared at her seat before they'd fully stopped, his face set with the intensity of someone watching a clock count down. "We're moving now. The situation on the ground has deteriorated. Hostile forces are probing the perimeter. Hammer estimates they have maybe 3 hours before they're overrun." Mackenzie grabbed her bag and followed him to the forward door, which was already opening. The desert air hit her with its familiar heat even at night, that particular quality of Middle Eastern climate that she remembered from too many deployments. A ground crew was positioning stairs, and military vehicles were pulling up alongside the aircraft. She descended rapidly, her feet hitting the tarmac with finality. There was no going back now. She was committed. Cross led her to a waiting SUV, military grade with no markings. They climbed in, and the vehicle was moving before her door had fully closed, racing across the tarmac toward the waiting C-17. The transport aircraft looked massive this close, its cargo ramp down and ready, interior lights creating a bright rectangle in the darkness. They drove straight up the ramp, the SUV stopping inside the cargo bay, where a full tactical operations center had been set up. Multiple screens showed satellite feeds, communications equipment filled a bank of racks, and a half-dozen personnel in flight suits and tactical gear were moving with controlled urgency. This wasn't a hastily thrown-together operation. This was a full-scale Special Operations Command post. A man in his 50s approached immediately, his bearing marking him as senior command even before Cross saluted. "Colonel Mackenzie Graves, this is Major General Stone, JSOC Operations." Stone extended his hand, his grip firm and his eyes evaluating her with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent a career judging whether people could handle pressure. "Colonel Graves, thank you for answering the call. I know you're out of the service, and I know we're asking the impossible. But the situation is what it is, and you're what we have." She appreciated that he wasn't wasting time on preambles or attempting to inspire her with patriotic speeches. "General, I need 3 things immediately. First, current real-time intelligence on the landing zone and surrounding hostiles. Second, complete technical specifications on the N-26, everything your people have been able to gather. Third, direct communication with the team on the ground so I can coordinate the extraction timing. Everything else we can handle in flight." Stone gestured toward the tactical center, where a young captain was already pulling up displays. "All of that is ready. We've got live drone feed over the target area, though we have to keep the drone high enough to avoid detection. The N-26 specifications are downloaded to your personal tablet. And Hammer is standing by on Secure Channel 8 waiting to brief you directly." The C-17's engines increased their pitch, and Mackenzie felt the aircraft beginning to move, starting its takeoff roll even as she stood in the cargo bay. They were wasting no time. Every minute counted now. She moved to the tactical display, studying the drone feed that showed the compound in grainy infrared. She could see the defensive positions clearly, 4 operators holding a roughly rectangular perimeter around a central building. Beyond them, scattered in a loose cordon, were the heat signatures of at least 100 hostiles, maybe more. They were being patient, professional, which worried her more than if they'd been disorganized. Organized enemies with patience were far more dangerous. She picked up a headset and keyed the channel Stone had indicated. "Hammer, this is Revenant. I'm inbound to your location. Give me the situation from your perspective." The voice that came back was gravelly, calm despite the circumstances, the voice of someone who'd been in bad situations before and knew how to stay functional. "Revenant, good to hear your voice. Situation is currently stable but won't stay that way much longer. We've got approximately 200 hostiles in a loose perimeter maintaining distance of about 300 meters. They've probed our position twice in the last hour, testing our response, gauging our ammunition. We've discouraged them, but they're getting bolder. I estimate we have maybe 2 to 3 hours before they either get reinforcements or work up the courage to rush us. The N-26 is approximately 200 meters from our position, sitting on the beach. We've done preliminary inspection, and the aircraft appears intact, but we haven't had time for detailed checks. The cockpit instruments are mostly functional based on quick look. The real question is whether those engines will start and keep running." Mackenzie studied the satellite image of the beach, measuring distances, calculating approach angles. The terrain around the compound was mostly flat desert scrub, which meant no natural obstacles but also no cover for her approach. The beach itself ran roughly east-west, which meant she'd need to time her landing to deal with whatever wind was present. "Hammer, what's your recommendation for my approach vector?" "I'm going to need to come in low and fast to avoid detection as long as possible, but I also need to avoid overflying your position or the hostiles if possible." She could hear consultation in the background, multiple voices conferring, before Hammer came back. "Recommend approach from the northeast, following the coastline at minimum altitude. That keeps you over water until the last moment and puts the hostiles between you and the open ocean on your exit. Wind is currently 5 knots from the northwest, so you'll have a slight crosswind on landing but nothing dangerous. The beach is hard-packed sand, surface is good. Your main concern is going to be the length. You've got maybe 800 meters of usable surface before you hit rocks and debris. That's going to be tight in an N-26. Tight was an understatement. The N-26 needed at least 600 meters under ideal conditions, and these weren't ideal conditions. She'd be landing at night on unfamiliar terrain in an overloaded aircraft if she was taking the team plus the asset. The margin for error was essentially zero. "Copy that, Hammer. I'll make it work. What's the plan for getting you and your team to the aircraft once I'm on the ground? I can't shut down the engines, so we need to minimize ground time." Hammer's response was immediate, suggesting they'd already thought through the logistics. "We'll collapse the perimeter as soon as we have visual confirmation of your landing. We've got one wounded who needs assistance, but everyone is mobile. Figure 30 seconds from the time you touch down until we're at the aircraft. Another 30 seconds to load. If we can keep it under 2 minutes total ground time, we should be able to get airborne before the hostiles react effectively. They'll need time to realize what's happening and reposition their weapons." 2 minutes. 120 seconds during which everything could go wrong, during which the engines could fail, the landing gear could collapse, a lucky shot from a hostile could hit something critical. But there was no other option, no alternative plan that was any better. This was it. The C-17 leveled off at cruise altitude, and Mackenzie moved deeper into the cargo bay where someone had set up a rest area with a cot and some basic amenities. She needed to run through the N-26 specifications, commit the cockpit layout to memory, prepare herself mentally for what was coming. But first, she needed a moment to process what she'd agreed to. She sat on the seat,